What's up guys, it's Atomic and welcome back to my channel. Genshin 2.8 brought back one of the most anticipated rerun characters, none other than the one and only Kaedehara Kazuha. While some say he is overrated and others say he is overpowered, reality is often somewhere in between the two extreme ends. Except this time. Today, I'll show you why Kazuha is the pinnacle of all Anemo characters by comparing him to every other Anemo support character. Before we start the comparisons, let me quickly go over how to build Kazuha. Since there are already many guys out there detailing how to build him, I'll keep this relatively short. You will want to go for a full EM stack to maximize Kazuha's buff through his second ascension passive. That is 0.04% elemental damage percentage for every point of elemental mastery. However, if you're planning to use him in a Geo or Anemo team, the standard attack Anemo crit main stat focus would be better, since Kazuha is unable to buff the damage percent of those elements. For his artifact, the 4-piece Venti Veneer set is obviously a no-brainer. It heavily buffs swirl damage and shreds 40% of enemies' resistances after a swirl reaction. For weapons, his best in slot would be the Freedom Sword, with the free-to-play option of Iron Sting coming in at a close second. Other non-EM 4-stars include the Favonius and Sacrificial Swords if more energy recharge is desired for Kazuha and or his team. The Anemo characters that we will compare Kazuha with are other Anemo support characters, which includes Venti, Sucrose, Sayu, and Qin. This means that Xiao and Hazel are not included since they are more carry-oriented. I will mainly be focusing on 5 aspects for this comparison. Gameplay, which represents how easy or fluid a character feels to play in the game itself. Utility, which represents how much utility a character provides to the team, whether that be buffs or healing. Crowd control, which represents each character's ability to group enemies together. Personal damage, which represents the amount of potential damage each character is able to do on their own. And finally, flexibility, which represents how many teams a character is viable and good in. Each category is worth a single point, and the character with the most points will win. Also, all 4-star characters will be Constellation 6 and 5 stars, including Kazuha, will be Constellation 0, in order to keep a level playing field, as getting a 5-star character obviously costs a lot more than getting a Constellation 6 4-star on average. With the criteria out of the way, let's start off the comparison with Sayu. Sayu's gameplay mostly involves her rolling around with her elemental skill, enabling her to deal massive amounts of swirl damage if multiple enemies are present. This skill, however, requires Sayu to remain on field to take effect, which means it is simply better to tap/short hold her elemental skill in order not to disrupt your team's gameplay. Her elemental burst is much better though, as you only need to deploy it and it will stay on field until its duration expires. Compared to this with Kazuha, his elemental skill comes out way quicker, is much easier to use, and has a hold version to further give players an option. Kazuha's burst is quite similar to Sayu's, which stays on field until its duration elapses. Overall though, their gameplay ease of use and experience is quite similar, with both characters able to quickly utilize their elemental skills and burst, then swapping to other teammates. However, Kazuha's gameplay is slightly more fluid, as unlike Sayu, his skill doesn't displace you, so the gameplay experience mark goes slightly in favor of Kazuha. The main utility Sayu provides to a team is through her burst healing, which at Constellation 6 is quite a lot even if a full EM build is being utilized, able to heal around 5000 HP per tick with 800 or so elemental mastery and 1.5k attack at top level 13. Aside from this healing however, Sayu provides no additional utility aside from the standard Venti Veneer elemental shred. Kazuha, on the other hand, provides a huge damage percentage buff that scales quite well, a whopping 40% damage buff at 1000 EM. While healing is definitely something very valuable, there are many other healers in the game that do just as well as Sayu. The damage buff Kazuha provides is not really present in any other Anemo character's kits however, meaning the utility point goes to Kazuha decisively. The crowd control point is going to be a no-brainer as well. Sayu has no crowd control for either her elemental burst or skill, while Kazuha is able to suck in smaller enemies and stagger medium and large enemies with his elemental skill. Kazuha takes this point decisively. The main source of personal damage Sayu has is through her elemental skill, where she's able to absorb an element and deal constant sword damage to nearby enemies. However, as mentioned before, this skill requires Sayu to be on field, which means while theoretically, Sayu has infinitely more personal damage than Kazuha, realistically though, keeping Sayu on the field for extended periods of time hurts her overall team damage. Meanwhile, her burst scaling is pretty bad, even with C6 in play. With 1000 elemental mastery, her burst will be doing 110% plus 200% attack at talent level 13, around 4.5k damage per tick with 1500 attack. Meanwhile, with Kazuha, thanks to his elemental skill's ability to potentially group enemies super reliably, he can consistently proc multiple instances of Swirl at a time, doing massive AoE damage. His burst, while not only costing 20 less energy and 5 seconds shorter in cooldown, has the same scaling as Sayu's burst at talent level 10 compared to talent level 13. It also does damage to all enemies within this radius and not only one enemy at a time, so Kazuha takes a personal damage point quite handily as well. Due to Sayu's nature of needing to be on field and or utilize her heal to be fully effective, she's not nearly as flexible as Kazuha as she is locked to team compositions involving multiple off-field damage dealers, like Xiangling, Fischl, and Beidou. Meanwhile, Kazuha is able to be utilized in a vast variety of teams, so Kazuha takes the flexibility point as well. At the end of this comparison, Kazuha wins decisively with a 5-0. Sayu is simply no match for him, as Kazuha is better than her in almost all team compositions except for a few niche ones. Hey, I like Sayu a lot too, but facts are fast and we just have to accept that. Now let's move on to the character that people thought Kazuha was the enhanced version of, Sucrose. Sucrose's gameplay is quite simple and is very similar to Kazuha's, both able to quickly use their elemental skills and elemental bursts, then able to make way for another teammate. The only gameplay catch for Sucrose is that 1, since her elemental skill does not impose any immediate crowd control near herself, or displaces her unlike Kazuha's hold and tap skill respectively, she is susceptible to being interrupted by enemies while casting her skill. And 2, if her burst is cast alone, you would need to stay on field in order to proc the Viridescent Veneer set shred, as the character needs to be on field for the first instance of damage. Overall, however, this is quite a small difference and is not impactful to make Kazuha's gameplay experience vastly superior to Sucrose's. The point is so split into half for each character. The main utility Sucrose has is through her second ascension passive, which allows her to share massive amounts of EM with her teammates after her elemental skill or elemental burst hits enemies, 20% to be exact. Her first ascension passive also helps to share a flat 50 EM after triggering a swirl reaction to party members with the same element of the swirl. This elemental mastery share is actually quite comparable to the damage percentage buff Kazuha gives, as 1, no other character is able to share this much EM with teammates, and 2, for certain characters such as Hu Tao, Xiangling, and Diluc, who are all constantly triggering vaporize reactions, the EM is just as worthwhile as the damage percent Kazuha provides. If accounting for Sucrose's C6, this means theoretically, her buffs actually have more potential than Kazuha's in those teams. However, her Constellation 6 is quite unreliable to proc, and the wrong element can be easily absorbed, unlike Kazuha, who buffs the damage percentage of recently swirled elements. This, in combination of his known absorption order of Pyro, Hydro, Electro, and Cryo, helps easily make adjustments if needed. The reliability of Kazuha will cause him to take this point away from Sucrose, but not by much, as in special cases, the EM buff alone can be just as worthwhile as a damage percentage buff, even not including Sucrose's Constellation 6. While both characters possesses crowd control abilities, Sucrose's is decisively weaker. Even though her elemental skill has 2 charges, it does not change the fact that it only crowd controls for a short duration after it's cast, while her elemental burst suction is lackluster at best. Kazuha, on the other hand, not only initially crowd controls with the cast of his elemental skill just like Sucrose, but also creates a small vortex that lasts for 3 seconds after using the empowered plunge attack his elemental skill provides him with. Even when comparing one Kazuha skill cast against 2 Sucrose skill casts, Kazuha's skill still CCs for longer. Kazuha's burst, however, lacks any CC abilities and only stagger enemies in its radius when it does damage. Overall though, due to Kazuha's CC being able to be utilized by teammates better since it lasts for a few seconds after he swaps out, Kazuha will take the CC point. With Sucrose having 2 elemental skill charges and a burst which could potentially drag in multiple enemies for massive swirl damage, she gives Kazuha a pretty good run for his money. The 2 characters deal very similar personal damage overall, but it does vary from scenario to scenario. The more enemies there are, the more Sucrose is favored if her burst sucks them all in, and the less enemies there are, the more Kazuha is favored as his skill does more damage to single targets. This point is thusly evenly split between the 2. While Sucrose and Kazuha can both be utilized to great effect in many of the same teams, the nature of Sucrose's buffs being Elemental Mastery and the inconsistency of her Constellation 6 will automatically make her less viable than Kazuha. For example, while both characters would be similarly effective in a Hu Tao or Electrocharge team, Sucrose is way less effective and consistent in a freeze team due to the nature of her buffs. Therefore, Kazuha will take the viability point by a very small margin, but a margin nonetheless. At the end of this comparison, Kazuha is favored with a score of 3.5 to 1.5. This is not to say Sucrose is weak at all, as she is just as strong as Kazuha in many meta teams. But in the end, the beta testers back in 1.6 were right about one thing, that Kazuha is an improved version of Sucrose. With both of the 4-star characters out of the way, let us now take a look at the 5-star characters, starting with Jean. Jean's gameplay with her elemental skill is rather awkward. As to utilize the skill to its full potential, players are forced to hold it for several seconds at a time. Obviously, you can just tap her skill in order to achieve a similar gameplay experience as with most other Anemo characters, but since tapping the skill CCs enemies away from the player, it creates additional gameplay headache as the player would need to chase down the enemy that was just pushed away. Her burst is just as straightforward as the other Anemo characters though, being able to cast and swap. Overall though, Jean's gameplay fluidity and experience is worse than Kazuha's, since her skill could cause chaotic and unpredictable behavior at times. The gameplay experience point will thus go slightly in favor of Kazuha. There are two main ways Jean provides utility for her team, with the first being the huge amount of healing built into her burst, which heals for about 900% of Jean's attack plus 7000 flat healing over 11 seconds at talent level 10. The other way Jean provides utility is through her burst elemental cleanse, and unlike other cleanses such as Benna's burst and Diona's skill, this cleanse is able to remove any element on a character by applying Anemo to said character. This causes a swirl reaction that can damage nearby enemies, which is actually quite an interesting mechanic, as combined with Bennett, you can constantly proc Pyro swirl reactions as long as both bursts are up. Adding onto the mix with Fischl and Chinchou, and you've got yourself the Sunfire Jean team, which relies on Jean's swirls to keep over-vaping nearby enemies. Outside of these kind of specific team compositions however, the degree of utility this mechanic provides is questionable. Overall, the main utility Jean provides is still through her massive healing, but this is still less than the potential 40% damage buff Kazuha can provide. However, the Swell Sword is also a pretty interesting mechanic, and with how rare cleansing is in the game, this point is thus evenly split between the two characters. It is obvious to any person that's played Genshin Impact that Jean is quite lackluster in the crowd control department. Her elemental skills CCing abilities are very inconsistent, either needing to charge up if held or properly angled if tapped to be effective, taking up lots of precious time. Meanwhile, Kazuha's crowd control is more consistent, lasts for 3 seconds after his skill has been cast, and groups enemies more effectively as well. Kazuha takes the CC point decisively. When it comes to the personal damage showdown between Jean and Kazuha, it's quite difficult to determine who has a decisive advantage, as they perform better than the other in different scenarios once again. However, due to Kazuha's more robust crowd controlling, self-buffing, and larger burst area, he is by far more consistent than Jean's elemental skill and elemental burst swirling reactions, which often relies on another character. Kazuha therefore takes another point decisively. Jean is not that flexible of a character overall, with her only viable team right now being the aforementioned Sunfire team. Meanwhile, Kazuha is way more flexible, being able to be used in teams of all elements and reactions. Kazuha therefore takes a flexibility point as well. At the end of this comparison, Kazuha wins quite decisively with a 4.5 to 0.5, but due to how Jean's main selling point is once again healing, it makes her a niche choice as healing is readily accessible everywhere else. Power level wise, she's actually worse than Sucrose, and her only saving grace is her cleanse and self-swirling mechanic. Only use her if you really need a healer in her auto options or need an Anemo character in your team for that 4-piece VV shred. And finally, we have none other than Kazuha's longtime rival, the Archon himself, Venti. Venti's gameplay is fairly similar to Kazuha's, both possessing easy to use elemental skill and burst. The core difference between the two is that while Kazuha has to stand somewhat close to enemies to utilize his elemental skill and burst well, Venti's skills and burst simply aim towards the closest enemy or the direction he is facing, possibly eliminating sources of interruption and damage due to them being cast far from enemies. However, this is more or less a small difference and a double-edged sword, as through my personal experience, I have not experienced any major hiccups in skill casting between Venti and Kazuha, both providing smooth and fluid gameplay experiences. The gameplay point is thus evenly split between the two characters. Unfortunately for Venti, he provides little to no utility value for his team aside from the standard VV artifact set Resistance Shred, with the only slight utility being from his second Ascension passive, where he restores 15 energy for himself and teammates with the corresponding element absorbed with his elemental burst after his burst ends. This means that Kazuha automatically wins in this category as his damage percentage buff is way more valuable than 15 energy for maybe 1 or 2 team members, plus 1 for Kazuha. When it comes to crowd control, while Venti lacks any CC on his elemental skill, his burst creates a mini tornado that sucks all enemies towards it, lasting for 8 seconds at a time. While Kazuha provides good crowd control of his elemental skill that lasts for around 4 and 5 seconds if the initial CC of the skill cast is counted, it is simply no match for Venti's strong and consistent crowd control through his elemental burst. Venti takes the crowd control point decisively. Personal damage is quite hard to calculate for both Venti and Kazuha, as both of these characters, once again, perform better than the other depending on the scenario provided. 10 small enemies, Venti slams. 2 medium enemies, about the same, and single target, Kazuha sweeps the floor with his elemental skill plus burst higher scaling. Therefore, theoretically, the two characters should average about the same if all scenarios are considered, and so the personal damage point is split evenly between the two. While both characters have their strengths and weaknesses, Kazuha is simply way more flexible than Venti. His damage buff enables him to be utilized in any and all teams, while Venti's crowd control based advantage is only viable of certain teams and in some cases, even certain characters. Skills such as Xiangling's burst and Diluc's elemental skill cannot reliably hit enemies CC'd by Venti's burst. Meanwhile, there is no such problem with Kazuha, as this CC keeps enemies flat on the ground and not off the surface. Kazuha thus decisively takes the flexibility point. At the end of this comparison, Kazuha pulls ahead with a 3-2 score against Venti. Keep in mind that this is largely theoretical. Realistically, Venti is actually way worse than depicted here. With the addition of more and more unsuckable enemies into the game as time goes on, Venti's value is decreasing by the day due to his crowd control becoming more and more obsolete. Kazuha, meanwhile, will remain relevant for the near future as there's still no consistent way to obtain large amounts of elemental damage percentage buffs, the way Kazuha provides them through Sucrose. Theoretically, Kazuha is better. Realistically, Kazuha is better as well. Sorry, Venti. Your time as the best Anemo character is nothing but a distant memory now. Long live the new king, Kaedehara Kazuha.